The guards placed a bucket in the corner of her cell and told the former Queen of France that this was now her toilet and they would watch her use it every single time because privacy was a privilege she no longer deserved, and what happened over the next 76 days would break her in ways that made the guillotine feel like an act of mercy she had earned through suffering no human being should ever endure. Her hair turned completely white in a single night, not gradually over weeks or months, but in one night of grief so profound that her body simply surrendered its color to the darkness consuming her from within. She was 37 years old, but witnesses at her trial would describe a woman who appeared to be in her 60s. The revolution had aged her decades and months, and it was not finished destroying her yet. You have heard the story of Marie Antoinette's execution 1,000 times. The guillotine and the crowds and the tumbling head held high for all to see. But that moment of death was actually the ending of her suffering, not the story itself. What happened before that blade fell is so disturbing that historians have deliberately softened the details for centuries. The full truth was considered too cruel for textbooks and too graphic for polite discussion. Today, you will hear what really happened to the woman who once wore diamonds worth more than entire provinces, while her people starved in the streets outside her palace gates. Her punishment would fit crimes real and imagined in ways that still shock scholars who study this period. The revolution did not simply want Marie Antoinette dead. It wanted her destroyed completely as a symbol and as a human being. Death was too quick and too merciful for what they had planned. Marie Antoinette was born an Austrian archduchess in 1755 to Empress Maria Theresa, who ruled one of Europe's most powerful empires with an iron will that terrified diplomats across the continent. She was the 15th of 16 children and initially considered too insignificant to matter in the grand schemes of royal marriage alliances. But fate intervened when her older sisters died or became unsuitable for the French marriage alliance her mother desperately needed. Suddenly, the young archduchess was thrust into a role she had never been prepared to fill and shipped to France like a diplomatic package. She crossed the border at 14 years old in a ceremony that required her to strip naked and change into entirely French clothing. Nothing Austrian could touch French soil, and this included every garment on her body. She stood naked before strangers as her identity was symbolically erased. Her new husband, Louis, was awkward and sexually inexperienced, and their marriage remained unconsummated for 7 agonizing years. The entire French court gossiped about what happened or did not happen in the royal bedroom, and pamphlets speculating about her. Frustrated desires circulated throughout Paris. She retreated into spending and fashion and gambling to escape the crushing pressure of producing an heir. Every purchase was documented and exaggerated by enemies who multiplied with each passing year. The Austrian woman was bleeding France dry, according to propagandists who invented stories faster than truth could travel. The famous quote about cake was never spoken by her, but the lie proved more powerful than any fact. By the time revolution exploded across France, she had become the most hated woman in the nation, and possibly the most hated woman in European history. The royal family was dragged from Versailles to Paris in October 1789 by a mob of women who had marched 12 miles carrying weapons and demanding bread. Guards were killed, and their heads mounted on pikes that surrounded the royal carriage during the humiliating journey back to the capital. Marie Antoinette watched from her window as the severed heads of men who had died protecting her bobbed past on wooden poles. Her children were in the carriage with her, seeing everything and understanding that their world had ended forever. The family was imprisoned in the Tuileries Palace under constant surveillance by guards who addressed them with deliberate disrespect. The Queen was no longer called Your Majesty, but simply referred to by the dismissive term Madame or worse. An escape attempt in 1791 failed catastrophically when the king was recognized by a postmaster who had memorized his face from coins. The family was dragged back to Paris in a journey that took days as crowds gathered at every village to scream insults and threats. This failed escape sealed their fate. The king was now proven to be an enemy of the revolution who would flee rather than accept the new order. Trust was impossible, and mercy became politically dangerous for anyone who suggested it. The monarchy was officially abolished in September 1792, and the family was transferred to the Temple prison. Their servants were dismissed and replaced with guards specifically chosen for their hatred of royalty. The former queen was now addressed as Widow Capet, using her husband's family name, stripped of all royal titles. Any guard who accidentally showed respect was immediately replaced with someone more reliably hostile. Her husband Louis was tried in December and executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette was not permitted to say goodbye and learned of his death only when she heard the cannon fire that announced the blade had fallen. She collapsed in grief that guards documented with amusement in their reports. The former queen spent days unable to eat or speak while men watched her suffer and took notes for their supervisors. But the cruelty was only beginning. In July, her 8-year-old son was torn from her arms in a scene that witnesses described as the most disturbing moment they had ever experienced in lives already filled with revolutionary violence. The boy screamed for his mother, and she fought so desperately to hold him that she injured her hands on the door frame. Guards physically restrained her while her son was carried away howling and reaching back toward her. She would never see him again. He was taken to another section of the prison where revolutionary handlers would spend months attempting to transform him into an enemy of everything his parents had represented. The child was given alcohol until he developed dependency. He was taught obscene songs mocking his mother. He was coached to make accusations that would later be used against her in ways that still shock historians who study this period. Her son was manipulated into claiming that his mother had sexually abused him. This accusation would become the centerpiece of her trial and the moment that revealed how far the revolution had descended into pure cruelty. In August, Marie Antoinette was transferred to the conciergerie prison, which was called the antechamber to death because prisoners sent there rarely emerged alive. Her new cell was a converted chapel with damp stone walls and rats that emerged freely from holes in the floor. She was given a thin straw mattress and a screen that provided minimal privacy for using her chamber pot. 2 guards remained in the cell with her at all times, watching her sleep and dress and attend to her most intimate bodily functions. She was suffering from severe uterine hemorrhaging that soaked through her clothing. The revolution provided her with inadequate supplies to manage this condition, and guards later testified about the blood with clinical detachment that treated her suffering as simply another detail to document. Her white dress grew gray and stained with blood and filth over weeks because she was denied changes of clothing. The woman who had once employed 300 servants to maintain her appearance now sat in her own waste, watched by hostile strangers. Her famous hair, which had required hours of styling each morning, was cropped short and had turned completely white. She was denied mirrors, so she never saw what she had become, but visitors described a transformation that seemed impossible. She spent her days reading prayer books when light permitted and sitting in darkness when it did not. She requested a priest for spiritual comfort, But this was denied because the revolution had abolished the church and would not allow its enemy access to religious consolation. Food was pushed through a slot in her door in portions calculated to keep her alive but never comfortable. She ate alone, watched by guards who commented on every bite and reported her consumption to superiors who analyzed the data for signs of weakness. Revolutionary officials visited periodically to interrogate her about conspiracies and hidden treasures that existed only in their imaginations. She answered with a dignity that infuriated her questioners and earned her additional restrictions. Her trial was scheduled for October, and the outcome was determined before any evidence was presented. She faced charges of treason and conspiracy, and the newly invented accusation based on her son's coerced testimony. The trial lasted 2 days, during which she was not permitted to sit despite her weakened condition. She stood for 15 hours answering questions designed to humiliate rather than establish truth. When the incest accusation was read aloud, the courtroom fell into uncomfortable silence. Even revolutionaries who wanted her dead seemed disturbed by the nature of this charge and the knowledge that a child had been manipulated into making it. Marie Antoinette initially refused to respond to this accusation. Impressed by the prosecutor, she rose and addressed the women in the audience with words that temporarily silenced her enemies. She asked if there was any mother present who could believe a mother capable of such acts. She appealed to maternal instinct across political lines, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed to recognize that something had gone terribly wrong. One juror reportedly wept. Several women in the audience looked away. The prosecutor quickly moved on to other charges, sensing that this particular accusation had backfired. The verdict was guilty, as everyone had known it would be. She was sentenced to death and returned to her cell to spend her final night on earth, surrounded by the same guards who had watched her suffer for months. She spent the hours before dawn writing a letter to her sister-in-law that would never be delivered. The letter expressed forgiveness for her enemies and concern for her surviving children and faith in a God who had seemingly abandoned her. She asked that her children be raised to never seek vengeance for what had been done to their parents. She wanted the cycle of violence to end with her death, even if the revolution wanted it to continue forever. She slept for a few hours, despite the guards watching from inches away. When she woke, she dressed carefully in the simple white dress she had been permitted and prepared herself for the journey ahead. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, and her hair was cropped even shorter to expose her neck to the blade. She submitted to these preparations without protest or complaint. Unlike her husband, who had been transported in a closed carriage, she was placed in an open cart used for common criminals. This final humiliation was carefully calculated to strip away any remaining dignity. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour because the route was deliberately extended to maximize her exposure to hostile crowds. She sat erect and composed as thousands screamed for her death. One artist sketched her as she passed, and the image survives today. It shows a woman who appears ancient, but sits with perfect posture despite bound hands and the certainty of imminent death. She did not weep or beg, or show any reaction that would satisfy those who wanted to see her completely broken. Whatever she felt inside remained invisible to the crowds that lined the streets. The cart finally arrived at the guillotine, and she stepped down awkwardly because her bound hands prevented normal movement. She stumbled slightly on the scaffold steps, but recovered without assistance. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and immediately apologized. Her final recorded words were a request for pardon for this minor accident from the man who was about to kill her. This small moment of courtesy revealed something that months of cruelty had failed to destroy. She remained capable of consideration for others even in her final seconds of life. She positioned herself on the guillotine without being forced. The blade fell at 12:15 in the afternoon on October 16, 1793. Her head was held up for the crowd as proof of revolutionary triumph. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. The revolution wanted her erased completely from existence, with no monument or marker to indicate she had ever lived. Her son died in prison 2 years later from neglect and abuse. He was 10 years old and had been taught to hate his own mother before disease and malnutrition claimed him. Her daughter survived imprisonment and was eventually released in a prisoner exchange. She lived until 1851, carrying trauma that never fully healed. The men who orchestrated Marie Antoinette's destruction mostly met violent ends themselves. Robespierre was guillotined less than a year after her death when the revolution turned on its own creators. The cycle of cruelty continued until exhaustion finally stopped it. France would eventually restore the monarchy before abolishing it again in cycles that continued for decades. Marie Antoinette's remains were identified through DNA testing in 2000 and was finally given proper burial. The unmarked grave had failed to erase her from history as the revolution had intended. Her final letter to her sister-in-law was recovered and published. The words revealed a woman who had found peace through faith and forgiveness despite everything done to destroy her. She had entered the revolution as a symbol of excess and emerged as something more complex. The frivolous queen had been transformed by suffering into someone her executioners never anticipated. The cruelty inflicted upon her revealed more about the revolution than about her crimes. The systematic degradation served no purpose except the satisfaction of those who wielded power. She could have been executed quickly after conviction. Instead, she was kept alive to suffer publicly for months as entertainment for those who believed cruelty was justice. The bleeding and the filth and the constant surveillance were not necessary for any legal purpose. They existed only to destroy her humanity before destroying her body. But she refused to surrender the dignity they wanted to take. She maintained composure through horrors that would break most people and went to her death with grace that infuriated her killers. Her story endures because it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. The capacity for cruelty does not belong only to tyrants, but exists in revolutions that claim to fight tyranny. Marie Antoinette's final days were indeed far more cruel than the guillotine itself. The blade was actually the ending of her punishment, not its culmination. She was destroyed systematically over months by people who believed they were serving justice. They were wrong about many things, but they were right that she would never be forgotten. Her name survives while her executioners are largely anonymous footnotes. History granted her a victory that the revolution tried to prevent. The woman who stepped on the executioner's foot and apologized had once been a frightened teenager sent to marry a stranger in a foreign land. She had lived through transformations that seemed impossible and faced death with courage that impressed even those who hated her. The guillotine took her life, but it could not take what she refused to surrender. Her dignity belonged to her alone, and she carried it with her into eternity. This is why her story still matters more than 2 centuries later. Not because she was royal, but because she was human, and because what was done to her could be done to anyone when societies decide that certain people deserve destruction. Marie Antoinette's final days were cruel beyond imagination, but she proved that cruelty cannot always achieve its goals. Some things remain untouchable, even in the darkest dungeons. She found them there and held on to them until the end.